I almost have been making this game in reverse in regards to I started with this like really cool art style and got like a near final version of the art assets out there. But the game lacked a certain depth, so I kind of took a step back and said like, how do I make this game better? How do I make this game like really good as a puzzle game?
So, to start things off, why don't you introduce yourself and give us the convention pitch for
Okay,
Desolus?
yeah, so my name is Mark Mayers. I'm working on Desolus, which is a first-person puzzle game where you travel between dimensions using energy from a black hole. So the world of Desolus takes place in this abstract surrealist landscape that's torn between multiple dimensions, and you solve puzzles by absorbing and transferring energy using a black hole. So I kind of pitch it similar to Portal, but instead of using spatial portals, you're using this black hole to power dimension gates, and you're traveling between dimensions rather than between through three-dimensional space like in Portal.
We've seen Desolus a couple times. We've seen it at PAX and at the Boston Fig. Um, but the first thing I wanted to ask was, where did this idea come from? Because it's pretty unique. I haven't seen many multi-dimensional surrealist black hole focused puzzle games out there. And I think that's probably a pretty logical place to start. Where did this come from? What's the significance of all these different elements to you?
Yeah, so originally, I guess I was working with a bunch of 2D prototypes of just the mechanics of black holes, and I wanted to make a game about black holes because I find them just like really fascinating in general. Like even my late grandfather on my mom's side was an astronomer, and he taught astronomy and physics for his high school. So I was exposed to a lot of these interesting physics concepts at a young age, and like I'm a really big fan of science fiction, etc. So I began the game as a bunch of 2D prototypes, kind of exploring gravitational attraction and just like how would you put a black hole in the game. So like originally, perhaps you can say the origin of Deathless was I began as like a 2D prototype that was almost like a clone of Super Metroid,
Mm.
but instead of like having enemies, you kind of just had this black hole that you could use to manipulate and absorb matter. And that was around like 2012. And in the global game jam of 2014, I started using Unity for the first time, and I thought like I'm just going to abandon what I have right now as a 2D concept and go to a 3D game with this new engine called Unity that I like didn't use before, and that turned out to be probably one of the best decisions I've ever
Yeah,
made.
nice.
Um, because like that just gave me so much more creative freedom to use like a 3D tool set that I just didn't have the luxury of having before with like a simple 2D engine. That was kind of like this weird esoteric engine I found that was very non-industry standard. So yeah, I began the game as like kind of just exploring the mechanics of black holes, and then it just slowly evolved over time through multiple iterations.
Cool. So in the latest build that you have out there, which we'll have some footage going over the interview, that you showed me at the Boston Festival of Indie Games, one of the things that really became evident and we could see in action was this idea of multiple dimensions and how moving through them affected the energy and the puzzles. Um, I wanted to kind of pick your brain about how you implemented that and what kind of challenges there were in working with what essentially the way I describe it is you've got two separate levels almost occupying the same space.
Yeah.
Um, so how did you go about putting that into the game? What kind of challenges did that come from? What kind of iterations were there of this system?
Sure. So from a design standpoint, the reason why I put it in the game is I almost have been making this game in reverse in regards to I started with this like really cool art style and got like a near final version of the art assets out there. But the game lacked a certain depth, so I kind of took a step back and said like, how do I make this game better? How do I make this game like really good as a puzzle game? I want it to be more than just like this beautiful environment you explore. I want there to be like a really good, interesting puzzle game behind it. So I had this mechanic of a black hole, and I'm just like, okay, so I have the interaction down. I have the absorbing and the transferring energy kind of just like solid set in stone. But what is the purpose of this tool? Like, why are you using it? So I came up with the concept of these dimension gates that allow you to travel between these alternate dimensions within the same three-dimensional space. Um, so do you want me to go into like technical detail
Yeah,
on how
sure.
I?
Well,
Okay, sure.
it's awesome.
Yeah, so the it was really interesting to figure out. Like I first started implementing the dimension gates back in around May, so that was like 4 months ago, like
Hmm.
5 months ago. And I was trying to think of an interesting way to do it. And so for those not familiar with like 3D rendering that like may be watching this in the future, so you have these things in the game engine called shaders that are used to render the object to the player. So like each three-dimensional object, like the trees or like the water or the sky, has a shader or like multiple shaders attached to it. So each dimension in the game exists as a alternate version of the shader. So from a very technical perspective, the first dimension exists in the value of 0, and the second dimension exists in the value of 255. And there's this thing on the GPU called the stencil buffer, which basically allows you to say, I want you to draw this value at this location.
Hmm.
So the dimension gates basically do an inversion between 0 and 255 and say like, I want to draw the first dimension or the second dimension, and there's this like really complicated system behind it to kind of determine like how this works. So each object in the game has two different passes on the shader that say like draw in dimension 1 or draw in dimension 2, and the dimension gates kind of just like allow you to transition between those. So
That's cool. That's really cool. Um, it's cool to get a picture and the workings of it. I like,
yeah.
even though I'm not a developer myself, it's cool to hear all the little technical bits. Um, so you mentioned that the art style was one of the first things you nailed down, and I kind of wanted to find out it there. Desolus has a very surrealist aspect to it, and especially in playing the latest build away from conventions, I think that's heightened by the soundtrack, which is phenomenal. In a convention setting, you don't get the same effect as sitting in a quiet room with headphones on. Um, what made you choose that art style? And clearly, since this is the first thing you worked on, I've got to imagine there's a pretty
Yeah.
specific reason to it. So I'm wondering what that reason is.
Yeah, so originally I kind of began with an organic exploration of what type of game can I make given my abilities.
Hmm.
So originally I went into this and I'm just like, I want to make the next like Portal mixed with like Metroid Prime, which of course is kind of impossible if you're just one person, especially if you have no experience.
Right.
So like this is my first commercial game before I did work on like those several prototypes as I mentioned, but
Mhm.
this is like the first, like this is like the real deal and it's my first time doing it. So I went through this process of thinking like, how can I make something interesting given my programming background and lack of like a traditional art background.
Hmm.
So I began by doing a lot of procedural art. So for example, like the sky in Desolus is made using a bunch of shaders, as I mentioned previously, and I have a bunch of settings that I can tweak to kind of like um, create this like crazy looking sky that's almost a simulation of real life. So through that, I slowly built up this unique surrealist art style because it's kind of like a emulation of real life, but it's
Hmm.
not quite real life in that it's like very heavily stylized. So it kind of just like organically grew over time, and then I kind of just like went and just ran with the crazy surrealist theme once I realized that the theme and the art style had potential.
Cool. That's awesome. So little insight into the background of Desolus, where it's coming from. But the other major thing we like to find out is how you got into indie gaming. So what brought you to start developing games?
Sure. So when I was in college in 2010, I was a freshman computer science student at Northeastern University, which is in Boston. And I've always loved video games. Like I've played video games since I was very young. And I decided that I wanted to make video games. And I was learning how to program because I was a computer science student. So I began with those 2D prototypes, like I mentioned, about ideas with the black hole. And I kind of just researched what engine I wanted to use, which was this 2D engine, and then I kind of just like started making the game. And I didn't really know what I was doing, but here I am today, many years later. Um, so I went with this 2D engine until, like I mentioned earlier, the global game jam of 2014 happened, and that's when I was introduced to Unity, and I made a few like really good friends from the game jam that I'm still friends with today. And I think that was my first like formal introduction to like the real game industry in regards to
Mm.
like I had the pleasure of working with someone who's his name is Chris. He's a lead designer at Harmonix, and he was one of the lead designers for the Beatles rock band. And he was like one of the first people that I met that actually like made video games for a living. So that kind of exposed me to like this whole new environment that I didn't have the chance to be in before. So I think that like going to game jams, like especially if you're first starting out, is just a fantastic opportunity to learn how to make video games and like meet people that you'll know for like many years to come and like learn from. Um, so after the Global Game Jam, I kind of reevaluated my 2D concepts and then switched to Unity, like I mentioned previously. And since then, I've been doing this as my part-time job. Like I work at MIT part-time doing computer programming, and then I work on Desolus part-time. And I've been going to conventions. I've been presenting the game like over the course of the last 2 years part-time. So it's been a really interesting experience for sure.
Cool. So you mentioned that you've played games your whole life. Not that surprising. But what were some of the games that most influenced you?
So growing up, I think the most influential game I played was just The Legend of Zelda. Like my first Zelda game was actually Link's Awakening on the Game Boy because I didn't have a console until I was older. So I played Link's Awakening DX, which is the color version,
Hmm.
and like that was one of the first games I ever played. So of course that like had a huge impact on just like my life in general and like what games I enjoy. I also later I started playing the Metroid series, so like Metroid Prime is by far one of my favorite games, and to some degree, Desolus is highly influenced by Metroid Prime. Um, Also later I played a lot of the Half-Life games and like
Hmm.
Portal, so that's another influence on Desolus for sure. So those were kind of like the early games that really stuck with me for until I'm like much older.
Mm. So moving a little more into the modern times, what other games are you playing right now? What
Yeah.
between the job and working on Deathless, what are you squeaking in?
Yeah, so I don't get a lot of time to play games very much anymore, but I have been playing a lot of like shorter artistic experiences. Like recently, Abzu came out,
Mm.
and I'm sure you're familiar. It's kind of like Journey. It was made by the same like developers for the director of art as Journey, and I think that was just like a really interesting short experience that was like really just creatively inspiring, just like the degree of just like immersion from that game and like the beauty of the art. In terms of like more standard games, like I bought the new Fallout 4 expansion, so
Hmm.
I've been playing Fallout 4. I also went and played parts of Elder Scrolls Oblivion again
Huh.
because so if you've played the Shivering Isles expansion,
Yeah.
it's this really unique fantasy environment that's kind of like surrealist, similar to kind of the vibe I'm going for in Desolus. So I went back and played it almost as reference because I'm just like, this is what was a AAA game back in 2007. And I think it's kind of cool that as indie developers were approaching what was possible with a team of like 100 to 200 people with millions of dollars, and you can create that similar fidelity with like one or two people nowadays with these modern game engines like Unity and like Unreal Engine. So I think it's both inspiring to set that as like a bar of like, okay, this was like state of the art back in 2007, but I could perhaps achieve this level of fidelity by myself now with this modern technology. So it's like interesting to look at that and see that as like reference. So
That's a
yeah, Elder
really
Scrolls,
that's a really cool observation.
yeah, for sure. Like if you look at a lot of the like Oblivion, I play like a modded version on my PC,
Hmm.
but this is like a graphical fidelity that is achievable by Unity by like one person in 2016, even though this took like $100 million back in 2005, 2006. So I think that that is just like a really interesting
Mm.
um, that technology has advanced this far, and like the democratization of these game engines has become prominent enough where like somebody like myself can actually make something of that, perhaps like quality art wise.
Awesome. So to kind of bring this to a close, this little glimpse into your life, um, what are what are some of the other indie developers out there that are doing something you think is really innovative or just really cool, that you think people might not have heard of, or
Sure.
is worth checking out?
Yeah, so I've been going to a lot of Boston local meetups for independent game developers, so I know a ton of people. One of them, there's a game coming out, I think, pretty soon called Rain World by James Primate and UR, who's from Sweden. And they've been making this game for like, I think, almost 5 years. And it's this exploration-based game where you play as this creature called a slug cat, and you're exploring this almost like a post-apocalyptic environment. And I think it's just really interesting like the direction they're going with that game. There's also, of course, a few people that I haven't met in person, but I think they're making interesting games. There's David Wheel, I think that's how you pronounce his name, but he's making this game called The First Tree, which is an experimental art title where you play as a fox. And it's reminiscent of Journey because you're exploring this like really beautiful environment, and I think the game has a lot of potential. There's also, I haven't met him either, but Dan Weibaum making Eastshade,
Mm.
which is a painting game, but it's set also in like this really beautiful landscape. So I guess I like games that are pushing these like non-violent interactive experiences that kind of like I think will push the medium forward for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're mentioning a bunch of games that are definitely pushing that video games as art, and I think Desolus definitely fits in there. So it makes a lot of sense that those would be the games that you'd give a shout out to. And I'm glad to hear that not just the action games are getting some shout outs.
Yeah,
It's the
I
more
mean, there are a ton
experimental
of
ones.
action games I'd recommend
Oh
too,
yeah.
but in regards to like the question you asked, like what
Oh yeah.
for people that are doing things like kind of off the set path and
Mm.
like diversifying the medium, like I think that those people are doing definitely interesting things for sure.
Yeah, that's definitely where we find the most interesting stories, both in development and the people behind it. Well, Mark Mayers, thank you very much for sharing a little bit of background about Desolus
Okay,
and about
thank you.
yourself.